I think a lot of people have heard of the GX4000 console, but they don't know much about it. Perhaps they've seen the odd video on YouTube, and they know that it didn't get many games, it didn't sell very well, and a lot of the games aren't particularly great anyway. But actually there's a lot more to Amstrad's computer range than just a GX4000. First of all, Amstrad brought out the CPC 464 in 1984, and it was really quite successful. It ended up getting thousands and thousands of games, and it lasted on the market for about 9 to 10 years. But being a company that didn't really make games, even though they published games at first, they made hardware and they made money from hardware. So they would keep releasing new models of Amstrad computer. So what the GX4000 is just another one of the models that they released. It was part of their new Plus range that they released in 1990. So really my main criticism of the GX4000 is that it is an Amstrad computer that's just been butchered, really. There's thousands of games that were released for the Amstrad computers that are compatible with the GX4000, but there's just no way for you to play them on the thing because it only accepts cartridges. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to show off some games that were released mostly after the GX4000 was released, just to show you that there's a lot more games than just the 25 or so that were released on cartridge. And I don't know, maybe you'll find it interesting. So this is Mr. Hely, and it's a cassette game. It's actually an arcade conversion, and I think it was on the PC Engine as well. A normal Amstrad would normally struggle with drawing too many sprites on screen or scrolling the screen because it doesn't actually have very game-friendly hardware. But this game has been programmed really well, and actually it has everything really. It has sound effects and music, it plays quite fast, it's got a fair amount of levels, and it all loads up in one go from cassette. It's actually quite easy to get stuck in this room. And I've never been able to beat this particular boss, but you can see here that it's like a bullet hell game. Now this is the second version of Double Dragon. It's a floppy disk game, and it's really scruffy. I don't think there was any time to put any polish into the game at all, so it does look very scruffy. In fact, the graphics look like they've just been quickly converted over from something else and just put in the game without being touched up. But the game runs surprisingly fast, and it's actually really good. I mean, this is another arcade conversion, of course, but this is actually really good for the Amstrad. So this is a good candidate to have been released on cartridge. And I think this is one of the games that came out before the GX4000, so it probably would have been criticised as just being a lazy conversion from a standard Amstrad game. This game scrolls surprisingly smoothly, and it's got all these different features in it. I don't know about this tune though, because it's not a tune from the original Double Dragon arcade game. It just sort of... it was made for the game. It was made for this version of the game, I guess. But yeah, no, this is actually really good. And I'm quite happy that I have a copy of this, because it's more common to get the bad version of Double Dragon for the Amstrad. Lemmings. Everybody knows Lemmings. And Lemmings was on the Amstrad. Well, to be fair, Lemmings was on absolutely everything, wasn't it? This is a game that was released late on in the Amstrad's life, and the cartridge format was basically abandoned at this point. But this game was available on cassette and disc, and I own both a cassette and a disc version of this game. The Amstrad version does lose a little bit of the presentation, actually. But they've managed to squeeze quite a lot of levels into this. I think there's about half as many levels as there would be in the 16-bit versions of the game. There's only about 60, but I think 60 is good enough. You know, and it's not lazy. You know, they've definitely put some effort into this. And I think actually the Spectrum version of this has one tune if you have 128k machines. This game works in 64k, but you get about 15 tunes if you play it in 128k mode. But this would have been absolutely fantastic to have on the GX4000 if the console had actually lasted that long. And yeah, what more can you say? It's Lemmings. Yeah, Cisco Heat. This might be a bit of an odd choice. I actually only chose it because I bought a copy of this game, just out of morbid curiosity, but I do know that it is actually quite a bad game. This is another arcade conversion, actually. Another reason I chose this is because there was a game that was released in very small quantities for the GX4000, Chase HQ2, and I'm pretty sure this game uses the same game engine as Chase HQ2, but perhaps this one might be a little bit more advanced, believe it or not. But it's by a company called Ice, I think they're called Ice. But they just seem to use this same game engine for all of their games, and a lot of them are not particularly great. This game really suffers from a bad frame rate and from the AI cars that just seem to go all over the place. And there's times where you hit obstacles that you think you're miles away from, and there are other times where you're bumping into something that you can't see. But I do have to give it credit for really nice pixel art. It does actually look really nice on a standard Amstrad. I got pissed off with it though, because I kept getting right to the very end of the race and running out of time, and I just couldn't get past the first level. In fact, there was even a time where I managed to cross the finish line, but because I ran out of time and I rolled across the finish line, it didn't count, and I just turned the bloody game off. But in fact, this is another game that's got music and sound effects in game. So yeah, apart from the fact that it looks like you're sort of playing on the outskirts of the city when it's supposed to be set inside San Francisco, it plays really badly, but it looks quite nice. Alright, Crystal Kingdom Dizzy. So this was the last Dizzy game that was ever released on the Amstrad in late 1992, 1993. And it was amongst the last games that Codemasters released before they moved on to consoles. I think shortly after this they started making games like Pete Sampras Tennis and the Micro Machines games for the Mega Drive. So it's actually quite remarkable that they hung on to home computers for so long. But this game's actually really quite slick. I think the team that made this game just created a new game engine for this game, so they made it from scratch. And it plays really fast actually. Some of the older Dizzy games did suffer from a bit of slowdown, and they were a little bit of a plod walking from screen to screen, but this one's actually quite smart. I didn't like it at first because I just didn't like the changes in the graphical style. But after getting used to it, I suppose, I actually really quite like this game. And this is a good candidate to have been released on cartridge because it's one of the only games that wasn't released in a compilation. Because obviously you don't want to re-release the same game over and over again. And yeah, this one wasn't re-released at all. And I think it didn't sell in very big numbers because it was just released so late that people had pretty much moved on from home computers at that point. But yeah, it's got a really funky in-game tune. But just don't drop your umbrella in the waterfall because you'll get stuck, like I did. There's a few reasons why I chose this game for the video. This is actually a mascot platformer, which you didn't see very often on the Amstrad. I suppose they didn't really become a popular genre until consoles in the 90s. It was made by a French company, Titus, and they really did support the Amstrad. And I think the reason why they supported the Amstrad so much is because the Amstrad was the most popular 8-bit machine in France. And so they released this game in 1992, so this would have been another really good candidate to release on cartridge. Titus published a couple of cartridge games for the Amstrad, but I don't think any of them were as good as this. So what I'm actually doing here is I'm stacking up these items so I can reach that ball at the top there, because that ball never disappears when you throw it. So that's a nice little touch that you can actually do that. Another interesting thing about this game is that this is the only 8-bit home computer version of Titus the Fox. It was never released on the Commodore 64 and it was never released on the ZX Spectrum. So that's a win for Amstrad owners, I suppose. It does make use of the Amstrad's quirky hardware to get smooth flip screen scrolling. Sometimes the game shifts between screens incredibly fast, but the game slows down a lot. For every sprite on screen, the game really slows down. So if you have about 4 or 5 enemies on screen, it's actually embarrassingly slow. But it doesn't ruin the game. And the music is a bit grating, I think, but it looks really nice. It's actually incredibly good pixel art for an Amstrad game. And it does play quite nicely. I actually really like this game. threw in footage of this game because I just so happened to have footage of this game. But no, not just that. I actually really like this game as well. This is Skull and Crossbones. And actually, this is another arcade conversion. Even though I like it, it's actually quite bad in some areas. The controls are incredibly awkward, and you don't really feel like you're damaging the enemies, and they'll just disappear into a puff of smoke. It's got the slowest scroller that I've ever seen on the Amstrad. It scrolls the game down to about 1 frame per second when it's scrolling, but thankfully the game sort of stays still usually when you're battling people. But it's got really nice music actually. It doesn't sound particularly piratey, but it's got some nice bouncy chip tunes to listen to. It was released in 1991, so another game that could have been on cartridge if the cartridge format lasted that long. And so if you're thinking of buying a piece of Amstrad hardware, just don't buy a GX4000. Buy one of the computers instead. But I should say, as a side note, you can probably buy a flash cart that will let you play other Amstrad games on here now, so it's not as much of an issue now as it used to be. That's the end of my video. I hope it wasn't too long, and thank you for watching.